We're continuing our sermon series called Teach Us to Pray. We got this title from Luke chapter 11, verse 1 that says, "Now Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us to pray.'" And then Jesus gave the Lord's Prayer as we know it. And we've been kind of going through all this, and we'll just quick blast kind of through it as a kind of a refresher to where we are. At the beginning it says, "Our Father in heaven," right? And what we see is that the Spirit of God comes to us crying, "Abba, Father," and it really reminds me of the prodigal son story and the father in that story. That's the point of that story, is that God is going to us and bringing us into the party. The problem is some of us are like the older brother and we stick outside the party. So we remember that God is bringing us in, and then we have "Holy is your name, hallowed be your name," and we see that God's holiness is greater than our unholiness, than any of our unholiness that we could ever do. And then it says, "Your kingdom come." And many times we think that God's kingdom comes as this huge, big thing. But Jesus says, "No, my kingdom is coming like a mustard seed." And so when we think of His kingdom, what are those mustard seed moments in your life, those little things that God has brought you to this day that bring you hope and joy? And then after that, we looked at that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And there's tons of ways we could take this, but I think what it is God's will is to lift up His creation and the pinnacle of the creation, which is His image, which is us. And that we are not to diminish the image of God that is around, that He is bringing glory to His image, and we are to do the same thing. So basically, like, don't just push away the Publix cashier lady, right? Like, or guy, treat them with dignity and respect. They are the image of God, right? And so then the next one is, "Give us this day our daily bread." And basically that one is stopping us to ask and see how God is providing for us. Now, I don't really know what Jim talked about last week because I didn't watch it, because I'm lazy like that. But if I was preaching it, it would have been all about how important forgiveness is, and that forgiveness is the mark of the church and the mark of a Christian. That if there's a Christian who isn't forgiving, all right, like, so that's kind of the point. The point of that, it's the mark of a Christian is one that is forgiving, and so that gets us to today. Now, I talked about this earlier. I'm going to do a disclaimer again. Today's sermon, I'm going to need you guys to put on your big girl pants and your big boy pants, all right? Like this one, it's good. I'm going to try to keep everything coherent. There's a structure that everything will flow into, all right? But this temptation, it's a big topic. It's a big topic, and it can be difficult, all right? All right, so because it's very personal to us. And so this week is lead us not into temptation. Now, we got to deal with something right up off the top. Lead us not into temptation. Is he saying that God is tempting us? Well, if you look at your bulletin right at the top, that's Luther's right in the front page. That's Luther's explanation of this in the small catechism. And what's like the first line there? It says, "What does this mean? God does not tempt anyone," right? Like that's what Luther says. God does not tempt anyone. So what are we talking about here then? What are we talking about? Because even in James it says, what Jerry read a little bit ago, it says, "Let no one say that he is being tempted, say when he is tempted that I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one." So what are we talking about here when we say all of this? What I think we are doing is we're talking about the importance of temptation and how it can affect us. And as I was preparing for this sermon, there was a quote from Luther's large catechism that really stood out to me. And it said this, that temptation, when we pray this, we're praying that we would not fall and be drowned in our temptations. Now, as someone who has just spent a week at the beach, this hit me hard, right? Like this hit me hard because when you're at the edge of drowning, what is going on in your life? Like you're doing everything to stop it, right? Like you're trying to grasp for anything. All of that is just that suffocating nature, and that quote hit me like a ton of bricks, because it's many times before we drown or feel like we're going to drown, we think everything is fine. About a year and a half ago, we had some friends visit us here on spring break. You saw them. It was Estine and Ryan. I don't know if you guys remember them. Good friends of ours. And they came, and we were hanging out at the beach over at Jensen Beach, having a good time, and swimming, and we didn't realize that we were actually in the current. It wasn't like a rip current, but it was pulling us out. And we're having fun and playing in the water and swimming in the ocean, and all of a sudden we hear this really annoying whistle sound from the beach, right? And we look over, and the whistle sound is a lot farther away than we were anticipating it being, right? And that's the lifeguard going, "Hey, you guys are being super dumb. You need to come in," right? You're way too far out. And suddenly we realized that, and we started trying to swim back, and it was difficult because the water was against us. And we're swimming, and the lifeguard ended up having to come out and pulled one of us in. The rest of us got in, all of that. But that's kind of how it happens, right? Like it's that we weren't paying attention at all. And so this prayer is living in the Christian life. It's recognizing in the places that we are weak, that we're being tempted, and it's being honest with ourselves. Because I think a lot of times when we think about temptation, other people's temptations are super evident to us, right? Look at that terrible person over there, right? Look at Dale. He doesn't do anything. Like that's, he really struggles with that. And so let's see if we can find our blind spots. So the big question today is, where are you drowning? Where are your temptations? Where is that? And what temptations do, they do three things, I think. They do three things, and that is they move us away, they rip us away from faith, hope, and love. All right? Because that's what temptations do. They pull us away from that faith, hope, and love. And we're going to walk right through the temptations and go through here. So, caveat, all right? Faith, hope, and love. The way we're going to go through this sermon is we're going to go actually through 3, 2, 1. Because if I said temptation pulls us away from love, hope, and faith, you guys would be like, that should have been faith, hope, and love. That's what's in the Bible. It's what it should have been, right? But you'll actually see the structure here in a little bit. So the first one is temptation pulls us from love. So what temptation pulls us from love? It's the temptations of our flesh. The temptations from our flesh. The temptation of the flesh moves us from love of neighbor to obsession with ourselves. You guys know this. Like we have the list that goes along with this. Unchastity, laziness, gluttonous, greedy. Luther in his large catechism says deceptive, as in defrauding or overcharging your neighbor. Like that, yeah? I've worked with a lot of people over the years that are like, oh, this is just business. Like overcharging people and stuff like that. It's temptation of the flesh is what it is, right? Like it's temptation of the flesh. And it moves us from love of neighbor to obsession, to the obsession of ourselves. So how is your flesh being tempted? How have you moved from love of your neighbor to yourself? How are you devaluing your neighbor to fulfill your own desire? I mean, the easy one we can pick on is maybe you're looking at certain images that's engulfing your life. And it only serves your desires. Or maybe it's a relationship with someone where you are just taking and taking and taking and giving nothing, and you are actually bringing them down rather than causing them to flourish. Or maybe it's in the form of a bottle that you would rather numb your pain than deal with the people around you. And before you know it, you're drowning. It's the sins of the flesh. It's the temptations of the flesh that move to where we're obsessed with ourselves rather than our neighbors. It's going out and not paying attention to some of those. So let's move to the next cheery one. All right? So we dealt with love down in the bottom. So the opposite of love for the neighbor is obsession with your flesh, obsession with yourself. So the next one is hope. And you know what that one is connected to? The world. And the temptation of the world moves us from hope. Now this one is kind of interesting. Because this one I think we all know we're super guilty of this. We're super guilty of it. And I know I am too. How many of you have lost hope in the world? That's a temptation. That's a temptation. You can tell because all the evidence for this temptation you think are okay to have because the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, right? Because if the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, then you're perfectly fine to have anger. You're perfectly fine to have impatience. And when the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, you think being hateful is okay, right? To have envy or hostility or violence. Like when you think that the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, you can justify violence. Violence is never justified. Let me say that again. Violence is never justified. You may disagree with me on that. You have every right to be wrong. That's my catchphrase for those that are new. But it's true. But it's true. The violence is never in the way. And the thing is we rail against the world. Right? We rail against it. We've lost all hope. So we begin to pick at straws, right? And we yell things like, oh, there's no hope in the world left. Like Jesus needs to come back and just deal with it and get rid of it and all that stuff and just start over. Like let's have some litmus tests. If you've ever thought that the world was going to end because of a president, you might be drowning. If you ever thought that the world was going to be saved because of a president, you might be drowning, right? If you've ever thought that the world was going to be destroyed or be saved by a Supreme Court pick, you might be drowning. I'm picking on stuff right now, okay? Like if you go home this afternoon or this evening and you turn on your favorite 24-hour news network and you allow yourself and your blood pressure to begin to boil at the hatred of the other side that is messing with your guys or your gals or whatever it is, you are drowning. And by watching it over and over again, you're allowing yourself to fall to that temptation to be pulled in by evil and be angry. Yeah. And you're saying, no, but the world is gone. Jesus is going to blow it up and it's all going to be done. That is a falsehood from the devil. Remember at the beginning of creation, there's this poem at the beginning of it, and there's a cadence. It said, what's the cadence in between each day of creation? It was good, right? He was created the world good. And yeah, we messed it up a little bit. That's what Jerry just read. We messed it up a little bit by temptations, but it never says that the world was never good. And I know what you're saying too. You're like, yeah, but at the end, we're all going to be raptured up out of this world and gone into the heavenly place. No, that's not in the Bible. That's in a book series called Left Behind. Like, it's not there. I know some of you are like, what? It's not there. Yeah, like I think sometimes we believe that the rapture is at the end of Revelation. It's not even in Revelation. Do you know what happens at the end of Revelation? The heavenly realms of God that looks like a city now comes down and aligns with here. It says it comes down out of the heavens here. It all happens here. God's salvation plan happens here. Jesus didn't shout down from the heavenly realms like, hey, you guys, you're all good now. You're saved because of me. No, Jesus was born here. Jesus was born through the pains of childbirth. Jesus came and he lived through the pains all through here. And what did he do as when he was walking around here? He was bringing hope. He was healing people, right? He was bringing hope. He was showing that the world wasn't done yet, that the creation wasn't done yet. And he even died here. And he rose again. And I know what some of you are saying. You're like, yeah, but he then rose up into heaven. But what's our Christian hope? Is that he's coming back. Don't lose hope in the world. God has done everything. Whenever we say that the world has no hope, we say that Jesus' cross was worthless, that it did nothing. But we know that Jesus has given us the victory so that we can stand boldly here and go, there is still hope in this world. Okay? That the temptations of the world to say this is all done with moves us from hope. And we are ambassadors of hope in this world. And then the third one. So we had love, and opposite of love is flesh. Then we had hope. Opposite of that is the world. And then we have the first one, faith. And the temptations of the devil or evil or Satan or whatever you want to call it moves us from faith. And this one's so sneaky. It's so sneaky because it drives us away from the goodness of God. It's sneaky because sometimes it's just that little voice in the back of our head which drives us from God. It's that voice that says, God won't forgive that. Man, the amount of people that have listened to that voice for years, that have said, that I've heard, that they believe that, oh, that thing that I did, God won't ever actually forgive that, right? Or they believe that I have to do more in order for God to love me. That's that voice that says in the back of it. Or the voice that says, I don't actually need a good Christian community for me to be around. I can do this on my own. After all, the Christian community will be there whenever I need it. That's not what this is all about. It's about being together in the good times and the bad. It's not about just coming to worship and then leaving. It's about coming to worship and then on Wednesday getting lunch with somebody or getting dinner with somebody or hanging out with someone's house and laughing and enjoying each other's presence, because there's going to be times when bad things happen and we need people to lean on. And there's going to be times when good things happen and we need someone to celebrate with. That is the body of Christ together. And there's a voice in the back of our head that says, you don't actually need that. You need to be alone. Because no one is as good as you. Right? It's that thing that separates us. And Luther says in his catechism, it says that these are like snares and nets, indeed, like real fiery darts that are shot like poison into the heart, not by flesh and blood, but by the devil, evil itself. And it leads us to despise and disregard God's word and his works. It tears us away from faith, hope, and love. And it brings us into misbelief, false hope, stubbornness, and despair, and denial of God. It makes us sense all of a sudden, like we're drowning, like these temptations, they sneak up on us, and all of a sudden we realize that we're way too far out, and there's a whistle that's blowing, right? That's called us to it, and we're like, oh man. Because the Satan, evil, it wants us to drown. And he wants to give everything to tear us away from faith, hope, and love. It wants to tear us away from that. Now, here's where this gets interesting. You guys have heard it said that Jesus was tempted in every way like we are, right? Now, I remember being younger, and when I would look at the temptations of Jesus, I'd be like, how? Like, I'm not tempted in that way. Like, I don't want bread that much. I don't want the kingdoms of the world and all that stuff. Well, I've been looking at it with a new light, and it fits right in with this faith, hope, and love. Because even the devil went to Jesus and tempted him in every way like we are. Because remember how he was tempted with bread when he was hungry. He had that temptation of the flesh, right? He had the temptation of the flesh and with that bread. And then when that didn't work, the devil took him to the top of a mountain and showed him all the power of the worlds around him. And he said, all these will serve you again if you just worship me, right? And to just have hope in the power that you could have Jesus. And he said, no. And then the devil took him to the top of the church, top of the temple back then. And he said, throw yourself off of here. Test God. Prove that you are as special as you say you are, Jesus. Prove that you are actually the divine one. Prove and make God your servant rather than you being his. Make him serve you, right? You see, all of these are connected. And you see, this is why the cross of Jesus is so important with all these things. Because normal people who are obeying the laws and all of that, they don't go to the cross. Normal people who are nice and kind and have a loving message and all that stuff normally don't go to the cross. They go to the cross for the bad things that they were tempted to do. But Jesus is different. Because he didn't go to the cross because he stole some bread, looking after his own flesh. He didn't go to the cross while trying to overcome some king like Barabbas did. He didn't go to the cross while trying to become some god on earth. No, Jesus did not fall to any of these temptations. But he went there not for his own sins, but for ours. For our loss of love for our neighbor. He went to the cross for our loss of hope for the future of the world. He went to the cross for our loss of faith in a God that redeems. He drowns our temptations on the cross. And he went to the cross and rose so that when we are drowning in our temptations, he's like that lifeguard, right? Who jumps in and saves us. And he pulls our head out of the water where our sins die so that we may breathe new life again. Baptism metaphor, right? He pulls us up so that we may again love our neighbor, have hope in the future of the world, and have faith that God will always save us from drowning. So, to close all this up, temptations are real and they're strong. And they'll lead us to this drowning feeling like we don't know which way is up. And God knows this. He knows that feeling because he was tempted in every way like we are. So when you pray, lead us not into temptation. pray to the one who is with you in the midst of those waters, trusting that he has been through the cross and has defeated temptation and will bring his life to you. And you know what? That's good news. That's good news. So breathe a sigh of relief whenever you pray, lead us not into temptation, because God's got your back.